Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk. Time for the show. Welcome back to Once a DJ. I'm here today with Off the Hook co-founder and Southern Hospitality crew member, Who Sampled Advisory, digital marketing agency director and good friend of mine, James J. Hamlin. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Adam.
It's going to be an interesting one because I only really got to know you as hip-hop and not hip-hop, but DJing was kind of on the way out for you. So really interested to hear your story of how it all began. So do you want to just kick off for us then? Where did you get the bug for hip-hop?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I grew up in the London suburbs in a place called Hersham in Surrey. And hip-hop kind of started to spread, I would say, from the sort of the mid to late 80s onwards. And up until that point, I was into music, as most kids were. Grew up as a massive Michael Jackson fan and into 80s pop and bands like the Thompson Twins and Nick Kershaw and Howard Jones, all that type of stuff, music that still love today. And hip hop, I guess, started to come along, and you start to see it. The electro compilations were huge, right? Starting to pick up those started to infiltrate. But I guess what was probably more important, I had an older brother who's 3 years older than me, and he was a lot more on it, driving it. Mike Allen was a very influential DJ on Capital Radio at the time, pushing sort of early electro, and wasn't called hip hop then, just sort of like rap stuff. And Westwood was starting to come through, and yeah, it was starting to just become part of the culture, certainly from an underground perspective. Breakdance battles at the youth club, which I was far too young to sort of participate in, obviously. And it started to come through, and started to certainly become part of who I was, and it was different, right? And I think that lots of people need to appreciate sort of back then, English culture and American culture was so different, right? They're much more intertwined now, and I think it was we were in sort of like boring grey Thatcherite Britain. It certainly seemed that at the time, but my brother and also me, we got into sort of, in air quotes, American stuff. So really got into American football and became obsessed with American football. That's a different podcast. I used to have an American football podcast. Into American stuff, even weird things like Dallas, or just kind of like Americana was so exciting, so interesting, and hip hop was part of that. And it started to come along sort of, as I say, like mid 80s. But my brother started going up to London, a place called Groove Records. I don't have any Groove Records stories. I was a little bit too young. Started to go up there, started to sort of get into hip hop tapes, things of that nature. And it was kind of part of the culture. And I just sort of like followed kind of suit, really, and started to get into it. I'd say I guess Run DMC in 87, Raising Hell, that really kind of put it over the top in terms of its consciousness, and sort of it became part of, I can remember Raising Hell. I can remember saying to my mum as like an 11, 12-year-old kid, I learned every word of every song on Raising Hell. I can't remember them now, but and that was like a real kind of applaud it for me back then, but kind of changed everything. But to credit my brother, my dad, actually, who was a massive music fan, super into music, wasn't into hip hop, he was into sort of guitar bands and stuff like that. He took my brother to a hip hop concert. It was Full Force, Lisa, Cult Jam, Word of Mouth, and DJ Cheese. In 86, so he would have been 13 at the Hammersmith Apollo, and I would just be waiting at home, like trying to sort of sponge up all this information of all this kind of stuff that was happening. It was amazing, really. So sort of got into it then, and then you had in the UK the sort of, I guess, more of the sort of popular explosion from a sort of chart-based music perspective in sort of 87, 88, 89, and I would have been 12, 13 at the time. Groups like Public Enemy, Beastie Boys, De La Soul, NWA started to really kind of penetrate, and just became massively involved in that, as were a lot of kids at school around that. And I think that was sort of hip hop's sort of first arrival, right? And I would say certainly in the sort of outer London suburbs, it sort of then started to die off. 89, 90 started to sort of like settle down again and a bit more underground. But that first kind of populist wave is certainly where I started to get into it.
Because I think with these things, you got this kind of boom era, and after that died off, a lot of people moved on to certain other things. What do you think it was that kept you interested, or did you kind of step away from it for a bit?
Yeah, it's funny, right? When you listen back to a lot of these podcasts, and you sort of, certainly in this country, like, yeah, all I ever listened to was rap, you know, and like 88, 89, 90 and stuff. That's fine, like, but there was such a finite amount of releases that actually existed, number one. And also the access to music was just so limited and so hard, right? I was a kid, so I was born in the mid 70s. So I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have access to imports, going to London and stuff like this. You know, there'll be things that you could find in a local R price with limited money. But I just didn't have access to it, right? But also as it got into the late 80s and the early 90s, you know, like a lot of kids started to get into all sorts of other music. You know, I can remember first seeing Nirvana on The Word. They did their UK debut performance, which I think was in 1990. I remember seeing it and going like, I don't know what that is, but I want some of that. Right. And, you know, so really got into the indie stuff as well, like 90, 91, you know, hip hop less so kind of that, but really got into indie stuff as well. That kind of like shoegazy, you know, credit Gary Crowley a lot. Used to listen to the Gary Crowley show as well. Used to listen to Sons of That. So simultaneously would listen to other stuff as well. Still kind of kept into it. But again, it was more back then, like, what was the music you could get access to, right? And that's what you would check out. It wasn't like now where I can listen to everything, let's pick what I want. It's like, right, I can find that, I can get hold of that. That's a radio station I can pick up. That's what I can figure out. But also like the journey you go through as a young person, you know, like it wasn't, you know, in my school, you know, from like 90 onwards to like 92, kids weren't into hip hop, right? It wasn't a thing. It was not like now, right? And you wanted to be part of the conversations with other kids. You wanted to be part of that. You know, I remember when Guns N' Roses came out, like everyone became a Guns N' Roses fan in school. So there was all that kind of going on at the same time. But I definitely had an indie phase. Not so much of the Manchester stuff. My brother was more into that, but indie phase, but also hip hop at the same time. And it was probably more like 91 ish. I'll be 15 coming into 16. I kind of maybe distanced myself from the indie stuff again and got back into hip hop, and that's where a lot of my I guess some of my favorite albums to this day started to come out. Some of my favorite rap bands from that sort of next era would come out, like KMD, Main Source, Black Sheep, UMCs, these types of bands. Get hold of those tapes and albums, and you know, through listening to the radio or you know, just kind of like through your friends or what you could kind of pick up and stuff, and yeah, sort of back into kind of like hip hop from then. But like, yeah, it was always a question of the music you could get hold of, which was always a constant struggle.
I think so. When I was a similar age to you, I'm a little bit younger, and so say when I was about 15 or something, it seemed like there was a crossover. Like, so the indie kids at school would have access to and be fans of certain rap. It wasn't overly siloed. Was it like that when you were at school, or was it very much more you're into this one thing and it's that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to the access point, right? So in order to listen to rap, we would listen to shows like John Peel, right? Or sometimes even like out on Blue 6, early Mark Radcliffe stuff, he'd sometimes play hip hop. Or watch like Snub TV, they'd sometimes play hip hop. Or watch the Dance Energy TV show, they'd play a bit of hip hop and they'd play like dance and ravey type of stuff and things of that nature. So it was, you'd get exposed to these other things and you'd kind of like, and you'd kind of journey with it and stuff. But it wasn't like, right, okay, I'm going to listen to hours and hours on end of this one particular genre. Like it just didn't really exist apart from listening to pop, you know, per se, which was kind of different. So, but again, as well, you're going through school, you're developing, you're kind of figuring stuff out, you're being exposed to other kids. And I think like there was also as you start to get out of the 80s into the 90s, you starting to the kind of like the rave culture is starting to kind of like, you know, come to the fore as well, and people starting to talk about that. And I was never really into that. I can remember, you know, kids would start getting into sort of drugs and stuff like as I was coming out of school. Like I left school in 91, 92 and I was like 16, so that was starting to kind of like bubble up as well. But it was very much kind of firmly hip-hop sort of started to become my path. As I say, leaving school 15, 16, like established a bit of a sort of little crew of friends there that was sort of into it, you know, and there we were, you know, we had like Raiders jackets and kind of like all that sort of like woolly hats and all that type of stuff. We had a bit of a crew there and a bit of a scene that we established, but that took a while for sure.
So when you left school then, what else was going on? Had you realised you wanted to get into DJing at that point?
Oh, no, not at all. So I can remember when I left school, say 92, and I went to college, so Brooklands College in Weybridge. I started to then be exposed to obviously more people. You know, it's a big step in your life when you leave school and you go to college. It's a kind of next kind of logical step. And I can remember I was doing computer science at college, so I was surrounded by a bunch of other people. And actually, there was a friend I made quite early who was actually had decks and was into DJing. His name was Lee Rawlins, and I want to shout him out. He actually died very recently, and he's about a week older than me. So, you know, God have mercy on his soul and rest in peace to him. It's incredibly sad, but he was a DJ, more into the sort of like the ravey. I can remember he was really into that Prodigy really early, like all that Charlie Said stuff. Really into that, and it wasn't really for me, but I was kind of like, I was exposed to someone with decks and DJing and all this type of stuff, and it was like, wow, and it was incredibly early. And I guess I kind of started to think about it back then, but also kind of, I would say one of the major turning points, you know, in 92 was, I can remember my mum and dad were like, they came in with this big announcement. We're like, oh, we're getting Sky. The Cricket World Cup is in Australia, which it was, and cricket fans will remember 92 World Cup in Australia, that amazing cricket team. And we're going to get Sky because the Cricket World Cup's on Sky and all this type of stuff. And we were just like absolutely, you know, blown away by this decision. This was incredible. And then once you got Sky, you got MTV, and then you got access to MTV Raps. And like for me, that was the kind of absolute kind of explosion of it. So you go to college on a daily basis, you know, sprint home, and Yo MTV Raps was on every day at 5 p.m. and on Saturday mornings as well. Every day at 5 p.m. and you'd just be there waiting, poised, finger on the videotape, pause and record button, ready to go. Because what they do is they'd show the show, but sometimes they'd pump in like random European rap videos instead of, you'd have like Dr. Dre and Ed Lover in the show being like, right, this is going to be so-and-so. And you're like, amazing. And it would be like some sort of German rap, Die Verstaatlichen Ver or you know, all those records they played at the time constantly on Yo MTV Raps MTV. But it was like the kind of this opening up to this portal of this world of just like, right, this is it. This is definitely what I wanted to do. And then since then, got exposed to, you know, my brother would meet his friends and other friends that were sort of DJs, people that were kind of into it. But it was then I was able to get a kind of like a part-time job in college and really start to get into record buying and CD buying, music buying. So kind of had the habit of every week of like being able to go up to London, because we're old enough to go up to London now. Shops like Mr. Bongo's, Unity, or also Kingston on Thames, which is probably the closest town to us. We go up to Beggar's Banquet, and like whatever we were hearing on Yo MTV Raps during the week, or maybe the Max and Dave show, listen to on Kiss, like Saturdays, it'd be like, right, whatever budget we have, what can we get that's come out that week? Albums, 12 inches, whatever, just to get hold of this music and get hold of this stuff, right? And just kind of listen to it and study it and you know, and kind of rotate all this type of stuff through. So it wasn't, you know, didn't have the thought of DJing. That only came kind of later, maybe like, I don't know, like 94-ish, maybe 95, when sort of had this record collection that sort of amassed over time, and more people were getting decks and do it, and you're going, well, oh hold on, got all this record collection now. I've got all this stuff, got a few ideas, got into it. Okay, let's kind of get into DJing as a bit of a progression, but it certainly came from accumulating a record collection first and assimilating my dad's collection, and my brother had a collection and all that type of stuff. That came before that.
What was the access like for magazines? Were they much of an influence?
Yeah, massively. So you have to remember how important they absolutely were. And look, for us, it was, the Source magazine was the ultimate in rap, right? And pre then, obviously, Hip Hop Connection. And Hip Hop Connection was in a bit of a weird place because we were sort of turning our nose up at it a little bit. It was, as it was going into the early 90s, it was just like, well, we got the Source now, right? Don't know about this Hip Hop Connection stuff. And it's funny the way it comes in cycles, in the fact that, the hip hop editorial staff changed, and, friends of mine to this day started to join, Andrew and Dan Greenpeace and Rob Percy and people like that, then started to change it editorially, and it became a lot more relevant later. But it was like, Hip Hop Connection, no, that's a little bit whack, to use the term that we used at the time. We're all about Source magazine or rap pages or things of that particular nature, because you could access them through record shops, right? And for you, it would be the editorial, it would be the reviews, but also just like the adverts, right? The adverts, like, it would just be like a portal in another world, like, to try to get the clothes. Like, we wanted to dress like these people. We wanted to dress like EPMD. We wanted to dress like these types of groups, wearing like Carhartt and Dickies and all that kind of workwear, overworn stuff. And you see that in these adverts, the Carl Carney and Cross Colors and all these types of adverts that you get in the Source. But again, it was such a portal into a different world because you couldn't get the access to that particular stuff. And you'd still have publications like, the NME lying around and things of this particular nature. But it was, how could you piece together these limited pieces of information, like with, back of sleeve notes and sort of magazines and articles. And because it was just, being a young person wanting to sponge up all that type of stuff, right, was incredibly important.
What was the part-time job you did at college?
Part-time job I did at college. So I had a couple. So I was, I flunked out of college the first time around in Weybridge for a number of reasons. And then I went to Kingston College and actually passed my degree. And I was doing a cleaning job, cleaning some office buildings, which were behind my house. But also I was selling, trying to sell double glazing at the same time. So trying to get leads for double glazing salesmen on the phones. So phone bashing, basically. And up until that point, it was then I was pretty focused on trying to get money to save up for turntables. That was kind of my sort of goal at that particular point. And I would also work with my dad on his building jobs and stuff like that. But I was like, right, wanted to get turntables, and they wanted to get Technics and stuff, and they were super expensive then, right? And they still hold their value now. But again, like, I can remember getting a secondhand pair of Technics, which I've sold one. I've got one to this day from the loot somewhere in I think I got them in like 95, something like that. So it would have been like 18, 19. So yeah, but tried to sell a lot of double glazing during that period. So if you bought windows off me, thanks a lot.
So after getting the decks, were you playing out quickly, or were you just like, right, I've got to practice, I've got to get to a certain level?
No, I mean, so it was a strange time, right? Because lots of people around me had decks, friends of my brother and people that I knew, and people were getting really good and all this type of stuff. But it was also like, I always felt like hip hop DJing back then, it wasn't particularly inclusive, in the fact that, like, what I really, really needed as I was kind of growing up was to sort of like to say to some of these people, like, teach me your ways, man. And I never really did that. It kind of felt like at the time, and I think some people, DJs of my age, could probably relate, you had to just crack on, right? Crack on, figure it out, just somehow work it all out in your kind of bedroom. And I can remember it was hard because I used to get in so many disputes with the neighbours. They still live next to my mum and dad now, and it's, well, so my dad's not here, but my mum now. And used to get in so many disputes with the neighbours, and I'd have like egg boxes on the walls and just kind of like stuff like this to try to sort of dull out the sound, because just trying to practice, all the beat matching stuff, trying to do mixtapes, because it was all about then, like, right, can you get good enough to do a mixtape, right? But again, that was a hard thing back then. There wasn't any 4-tracking. There wasn't any kind of like editing software. You had to be able to do like and you also had to be able to turn the tape over, right? So you had to be able to do like a kind of 60-minute mix, or at least 2 30-minute mixes, to sort of establish you were good enough at DJing, whereas not being good enough at DJing. So it's a bit of a weird system now when you kind of think about it. But yeah, just trying to sort of overcome those. I'm not going to make them out as obstacles, but obstacles at the time, just trying to sort of get good. And I can remember, when was the first time I actually DJ'd out? I don't even remember specifically. I think it might have just been like a random house party or some sort of basic club or whatever it was. But it was just, you just got so focused on your bedroom in terms of like, right, all these bits work like this. And I can remember just being in a club or a party, first of all, and being like, this is all totally different. I have absolutely no idea how this kind of works. But no, that didn't happen for a fair while, just because, again, I didn't really think I was good enough and all that type of stuff. And again, I was trying to get mixtapes out there, and I did a few, and I was kind of all right with them, but that was the viral kind of angle, right? Listen to my mixtape, listen to my mixes and kind of like figure it all out and just kind of go from there, really.
Were you quite good at kind of pushing them on people?
Not really. I can remember I was working I had a little IT job during the summer, and I can remember I got my mate Jig to sort of design me a little cover, and I did my first ever mixtape that I quote unquote released was called Musical Biscuits. And any of you who've seen the film, The Harder They Come, Hilton the DJ, that's a reference from The Harder They Come, and it was kind of like, it was just enough of a mix to kind of get out, and I probably made like 20, 30 of them and gave them to a few mates, and hopefully they put them in their cars and listened to them and stuff like this. But it was like, right, okay, I can kind of do this. But it was never really at that stage, never really on a kind of like wide scale. Like, I wasn't really good enough. I wasn't really kind of progressing with it. There was DJs at the time that were really, really going for it. And I was actually surrounded by some DJs that became mates with my brother and then became friends with me, that were just really kind of pushing that forward. My mate Steve, who went by DJ Gonestein, and who else? My mate C, who went by Rotation, and also like the Cam tapes from Mr. Bongo. They kind of get in our stratosphere as well. So people were definitely doing it, and it was really kind of inspirational. But I can remember at that time, close to that time, hearing, and it's still on the internet now, you can listen to it, the DJ Riz, when he did the mix on Westwoods in 94, when he did the first mix like on a 4-track. I remember hearing that for the first time in 94, and so I'd be 18, 19 and being like, this is absolutely unbelievable. Like, what can be done in this type of art form? And I didn't necessarily aspire to that particular level, but it was certainly something that I was trying to do, probably not that successfully, but trying to do as part of the journey.
I think that mix still stands up now, though, doesn't it? There's two Riz ones that are just insane. It
look insane, right? And again, it can stand up against anything now. And you listen to it then, and now you go back to like the technology that he was using to do it. And again, Westwood was so ahead of his time pushing this type of stuff. But yeah, absolutely, absolutely incredible. One of my favourite mixes ever to this day.
Yeah. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying Once a DJ. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show, and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on. So I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com. And if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. If you're an avid collector of timeless music on vinyl but don't have the budget to fork out for those pricey originals, then look no further than Be With Records. From library music to yacht rock, jazz, hip-hop, disco and beyond, Be With lovingly reissue some of the coolest classics. All of their records are carefully remastered and cut to the highest standards to make sure the pressings are of peak audio quality and do justice to the music being released. And something else to note is that they don't do limited runs to drive up resale and hype. If the demand is there, they'll repress, as the focus is the music, not the profit margin. They have flat rate shipping and free UK shipping on orders over £60. And if you head to bewithrecords.com and use the discount code onceadj, all one word, you'll get 10% off your order. So head to bewithrecords.com and level up those crates today. So what came next then? When did the DJing really kick on?
I would say that the next thing that probably happened in my life was I went to university in '96, and I went to Derby University, and it was funny, right? So which is ultimately where we went to meet. So up until that particular point in time, I'd actually I got really good grades in my HND. I basically got distinction in my HND, so I could have really gone anywhere, right? And gone anywhere to uni and basically done anything, which is weird. But again, it's such a weird time when you think back to it. And it was completely subsidised university at that time. And my parents didn't earn a load, and I got a maintenance grant and stuff. It'd be like, right, university's an option for you now, son. What do you reckon? And it was like, oh, is it? Okay, fair enough. And then I can remember I hadn't done any beat making or anything like that. I'd been exposed to it a little bit. I'd seen a little bit, but, I was obsessed with like Pete Rock and Dr. Dre and Large Professor and Redman and all these types of things. I'm like, right, I want to be doing that. And then in the UCAS book, used to have a UCAS book, there were these 2 courses called Music Technology. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to read any of the detail here, but there's a picture of somebody in a studio. That's what they're doing. I want to do that. Right, because I was like, yeah, I'm not that motivated as a person. I'm not massively into academic stuff. I might flunk out of uni, but if you can go and use a music studio, that's what I'm going to do. And it's crazy to hear this story because, like, my parents were just kind of like, went, yeah, whatever, just do whatever you want, which is not what I would do with my children. But it's like, and then I looked at the map and I was just like, right, there was 2 courses. One was in Derby and one was in Salford, and I was like, oh, Derby's closer to home. I'll just go to that one. Went along, and that was it, and basically got into it, and then went to Derby to university, and I didn't take my decks with me. I hadn't had them long, maybe a couple of months, so it was a weird time because I wasn't really that good at DJing, not really, or confident. So I kind of didn't want to rock up with decks and be like, hey, yeah, because people would be like, right, show us your stuff, and I'd be like, can't really. So it was a little bit of a sort of learning on the job, as it were. But then I kind of got up there sort of back end of '96, and it was cool. It was interesting because I can remember when getting there, and this is, people go back and be, oh yeah, '96 was an incredible year for music, and it was. But back at that time in the Midlands in the UK, there were 3 types of music that we were exposed to as kind of students in that world: cheese, indie, or house of some description. And I was interested in none of them, right? So it was about not only how can you get out there, how can you be exposed to kind of hip hop and these other types of music. And I can remember being quite anxious before I went to university, as most kids are. But I was thinking like, oh, what if I get up there and no one else is really into hip hop? Like, I'm really going to struggle. Like, how am I going to meet people and stuff like that? Which was a kind of valid, but also no one was really into hip hop. I was thinking about it the wrong type of way. No, but also it was cool because it also, the friends I made weren't they weren't really into hip hop. They sort of were, but it was a great lesson for me because that didn't matter. Your friends are your friends, right? The interests you share are just kind of part of it, and that was really good. But sort of got up to uni, and there was some good record shops up there. Started to meet some people up there, and some people on the music technology course, and sort of like put the name about a little bit and stuff. But there was no existing promoters. Well, there kind of was. There was I got a shout out to my mate Dave H and Skip. They were doing stuff, Derby Jazz Massive at the Gatehouse on a Saturday, and that was cool because it was just we used to go there a lot. Eventually on a Saturday night, well, most people would be going to sort of Progress and things like that. That was a place where you could just sort of hear more sort of funk and soul music, really, on a commercial angle. You'd hear Signed, Sealed, Delivered, and Cross the Tracks and all these types of things. There's nothing wrong with that, but it was just like, right, okay, exposure to, I guess, sort of like more black underground music, which was good. But I'd say that the big sort of exposure to it, sort of DJing, was I can remember our student union had a DJ competition. and it was run by a guy I kind of know, by called Patrick Patel, and they were like, right, here's a DJ competition. All the DJs in the uni, you can come and participate in it. You can get to play, and then you can sort of like. Now, I'm not going to call it a battle. It wasn't a battle of any kind, which was probably fortunate, made it a little bit more entertaining. So I sort of went in for that. And it was interesting. So who else was in that DJ competition? So my friend Alex, DJ Hudson, he was in it. Fortunately, he was in a different category. He was in the house category. You'll have to ask him why he did that. He went in the house category. Yeah, right. And then also Dan Moore, D-Boy, was in it. He was in the same category as me. And I was in the kind of, there wasn't enough hip-hop DJs, but I was in that kind of like, because the music I was sort of playing then was a bit of a sort of smorgasbord. I wanted to play hip-hop, but it was more like fast rappy type stuff, right? Mixed with a bit of big beat, mixed with a bit of sort of drum and bass, mixed with a bit, anything sort of fast and stuff like that. So I was in that kind of category. And somehow I got through to the final of that. And then I can remember playing a mix in the final. It was like, it's a classic mix. People still play to this day. It was like, I Know You Got Soul, into like Fool's Gold, into like Raw, into that type of tempo type stuff. And then managed to get to the final. I didn't do amazingly well, but then I got a slot at the May Ball, which is like a big sort of, if you got in the final, you got a slot at the May Ball, which is like a a sort of interesting thing. But it was meeting other DJs. I met Dan Moore, who went on to start Technique. It was a club night and stuff, which I ended up DJing at. Meeting other DJs, exposed to it, and you're out and about, and you're like, right, okay. But also sort of getting to be slightly known within that sort of university entertainment infrastructure. And that was the kind of that allowed me to sort of start to sort of hustle a bit and start to, because I was okay with that. I was all right opening my mouth and talking to people and stuff like that, and starting to get to know people. And that was kind of like how I could sort of start to sort of get in that sort of world. And that was really how I kind of got my sort of first break in DJ gigs in the area. And I can remember through doing what I did in that type of scene with our student union, it would be like, and shout to Sean Durney, I hope he listens to this. He helped me out with a lot of this. He always says all right to me on my birthday, so I should send him this if this comes out. He would be like, right, I'm booking an act that's in your kind of world, and you did this on this DJ competition, right? You're obviously fit that world, away you go. So that was good. I can remember, I hope I remember this right. I think I may have done the very, very early warm-up, I think to LGJ Bookham. I think so, before anyone was even in the club. And then, I think I did that. And I can remember my mates critiquing it at the same time. I wasn't really playing drum and bass, more sort of warm-up stuff. So that's kind of how I started getting gigs and knowing people in that world.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, the warm-up DJ slot. By that point, were you really kind of thinking about what the audience is and planning for these sorts of things? Or was it just like, I've got a bag of records, I'm going to play what I feel? I think,
look, you always have to remember back then, it was all about the access to the music that you could get and what you could afford, and then as a result, what you could play. And also in my head, I also had this thing in my head where I'm like, all right, when I DJ, those people saw me DJing before, like a month ago, but like I can't play the same records, certainly not in the same order. I used to think that, right? It's so strange, and I kind of went completely the other way later in life, because what I didn't really figure out is actually people like and respond to repetition. Different records, different order. So I used to think about all that, but it was all about what you could accumulate and also what you could afford to do, right? So if you think about the open format DJ era now, and maybe talk about that later, it was the opposite of that. It was like, what can I get access to that you're going to like? In the back of your head, you were like, I want to educate people at the same time. And because you spend a lot of time in your bedroom thinking about it, you're like, right, I'm going to play this track that just no one's heard of, and they're just going to spontaneously start. Well, none of that's true, right? None of it's true, but sometimes it is, right? The interesting thing about back then was, how could you get access to music, but also without having the money to get it, right? So one of the big things back then was getting on records distribution lists and record pools, which was, again, a bit of a cycle. So you could get onto these record pools and get sent free records if you had your name on enough flyers, right? And you could submit enough charts. So much of the motivation was to get on flyers. Doesn't matter if you're a warm-up DJ. Doesn't matter if your name was at the bottom of the bill. You would then send your name off, send these flyers to these people and say, look, I'm playing out to these people, blah, 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 send me free records. And when you get free records, you'd be able to then, you'd have these records in your bag. It wouldn't really matter. And a lot of the stuff you get sent wasn't very good, but it allowed you to accommodate to more of these types of requests and scenes, as it were. But again, back then, I was never comfortable just playing sort of rap music. The rap music wanted to play in like, sort of, this is like 90, 97, 98, because people just weren't really into it. And I wasn't really into the jig stuff. I wasn't really into the R&B, not really playing it out loud. So it would just be like, how can you get through this enough by playing the stuff that you want to play, but also kind of accommodating, number one, but also how can you not waste the limited funds you have because you want to buy your underground stuff, but also having the other music as well. So that was the game I was playing, and other my friends were playing at the same time as well, and it's certainly an interesting one.
With the sort of places you were playing, was it just student, or like, what I mean is that, were you playing places where people had to dress up to go out? Because it was a big thing, wasn't it? Kind of shoes and dark trousers and shirts and stuff in some places.
I would play some university-made balls, but that would kind of be it. But right. I started to, I know there was a club night that started in our town in Derby called Technique, which was drum and bass on one floor and sort of other, in brackets, eclectic type stuff on the other floor. And I started to get a few DJ bookings at that, which was cool. And, you know, Dan Moore, who's still friends to this day, and I still do work with to this day, sort of did that. And that was really, really interesting and important, because that was the ability to get up and DJ and play other stuff, right? And I was never really into the kind of the bleepy sort of like electronic-y type stuff, not really. Everything had to have a kind of like a hip-hop sort of framework. So hip-hop breaks, you know, some fasty breakbeaty type stuff, but like it would be sort of hip-hop stuff I was into. So I started to play some of those gigs, but not really loads. It was only kind of like then latter days I started to get some gigs actually with the student union, and I was playing at this place called the Late Bar, which is a place that everybody went to, which is pretty cool. It was like open till like 10 till 2. Everybody went there, and I would DJ there, I think every Friday, and I would get like, I think £65 or whatever. I knew that was good money because I used to do the Monday night slot at the Late Bar, and that was £20, right? But you laugh, right? But it was still, you know, it was still over £5 an hour for just playing some records. It was better money than doing anything else, right? So I would started off doing that on Mondays, and then my flatmate Andy, he then started doing the Monday show, and I would do Fridays at the Late Bar, and then it then progressed up to, I was doing Fridays at the Late Bar, and then I got a gig in Nottingham at this place called the Rope Walk, which is kind of like, again, it was a bit sort of corporate. But back then I was doing a Friday night gig and a Saturday night gig in an open format type of style. Lots and lots of calls for like lots and lots of R&B, and I was not into R&B then. So I would be playing garage, drum and bass, bit of house, disco, just kind of open format stuff as you'd consider it now, and you do quite effortlessly. But because it was all powered by vinyl, and all powered by vinyl that you had to buy, it was a little bit different, because people are like, right, that big record's out this week. Oh, can you play that? And I'm like, well, I'm getting 60 quid for this gig. You know, if I've got to spend, 5% of my money on getting that record, I'm not left with anything. So it was always a constant battle and a constant fight of trying to sort of go to car boot sales and kind of fill it in with stuff and do all these other types of things. But, you know, I was also really fortunate in the fact that, you know, I left university in a good place financially, because I had these DJ gigs and just sort of came about through sort of being out there and access to the music and just being prepared to do it. But in the back of my mind, hip hop was always what I wanted to do, and samples and break stuff is what I wanted to do, but it wasn't something I could do to that particular audience. So it was just kind of, it felt like a bit of a job, but it was also something, it did certainly get me out there. And I would do some sort of hip hop stuff in house parties at a kind of much kind of smaller level. But that's kind of how it was back then.
Yeah, I think another thing as well about those kind of like song of the moments, it's not only that you've got to spend your money on that one song that's taken away from what you want, it's also that song might have a shelf life of about 2 weeks and then no one wants to hear it again.
Yeah, well, exactly, right, and that was what was so crucial about getting on the record pools, right? So I was at its peak, and I got some of my friends onto it as well. I was probably on maybe 3 or 4, 5 record pools. And it was amazing, right? Because you get sent these packets and you wouldn't know what would be in them, right? And sometimes it would be like, all right, it's exactly that, or sometimes it would be a load of plop, right? But then also it was the same time that eBay was starting to come up, right? So that I then started that hustle of like selling the stuff I didn't want onto eBay at the same time, because I can remember I got Ghetto Gospel by Tupac and Eminem, right, which I had really no interest in. I wasn't into that side of rap really at all. Remember, I got sent that. I sold it on eBay for like 75 quid, like that week, because it wasn't in the shops for another week. Someone really kind of wanted it, right? So it did do that, but it was all part of the hustle. I can remember I used to get paid in checks. People used to send me checks. So I'd be up and down to the post office, getting these packets, figuring it out, filling out charts, like all this kind of admin and faff. But again, it was just early hustle, trying to just sort of put it all together, because the other way would be like, no, I'm just going to go and just spend all my money. I wouldn't have any money. I wouldn't have any petrol in my car, you know? So that was the kind of way that I did it. But you're right. It was like these songs would come out of nowhere. And sometimes you'd have to get them. And it was, I guess Garage would be the one in like 90, maybe like 95, 96. Sorry, I get my timeline wrong. Maybe later, maybe like 98, 99. Every week there were number one song in the charts would be a Garage song, right? Like it went through that run, didn't they? Sweet Female Attitude and Chocolate Boy and all that type of stuff. So you'd have to be buying them. You'd really have no excuse. But then you had a little Garage half an hour there. You're like, okay, right, that's my Garage half an hour. Sort that. Little house half an hour. Sort that. Little bit of nostalgic rap. Sort that. All that type of stuff. So like, yeah, good times.
So was this after uni, or were you still at uni at this point?
Yeah, so I finished uni in 99. I didn't have a particularly great grade in my degree. I was more into the lifestyle, really. I'd done some music and beatsy type stuff at uni, not loads, because the course that I'd signed up to, if I'd read the small print, which I would advise everyone to do, the actual exposure to actual studio stuff was very, very limited. Made some tracks in the studio, did some bits and bobs, did some basic sampling, did some other kind of stuff up until then. But I was very much just kind of finished uni in 99, and then I went to America and did Camp America for in 99, and I was in America for like maybe 5 months, a couple of months in Camp America, and then and a couple of months kind of traveling around, and that was huge, because up until I'd never been to America before, and I'd had my brother's friend had been before a couple of years before on some sort of university exchange, and he'd brought back all these records. And they were actually at my brother's. He lived with my brother. My brother moved to London at this point, and that was cool because I used to go there a lot. And I was in London a lot then, going to gigs, because also that was the start of the second sort of hip hop sort of revival, as it were, right? In like, 98, 99, like the Scratch Club night and the advent of the Scratch Perverts and like all that type of stuff. It was starting to come back quite quickly. I can remember Hip Hop You Don't Stop CD was huge and massively influential. So it was the sort of start of that second hip hop comeback wave, which was really interesting. And then, so my brother's friends brought back all these records from America. He'd been to Minnesota, stuff I'd never heard before. And it just blew my mind, because it was like all the samples, all the breaks, but all the sort of next level stuff. So what were we listening to? Like Miroslav Vitus and like Les McCann and kind of Jimmy Smith, and just like all these kind of like Ramsey Lewis, just like all these LPs I'd never even heard before, all American pressings. It just blew my mind, and I'm like, whoa, this is another level, right? So I was like, I need to get to America. I need to kind of get exposed to all this type of stuff and check it out. So went there in 99. Again, the things you could get away with back then is, it's a lot of fun. I can remember just going to America, and we traveled around all sorts of places, Philadelphia and Canada. And I can remember, finding David Axelrod LPs and all sorts of stuff like that. And we bought back this like enormous, like cardboard box full of records. And like, we went to the we went to the person at the airport. We're like, we're going to get there super early. We're just going to be British, and we're just going to be young, and we're just going to be nice, and we're just going to hope that they let us through with it. And it worked, right? It worked. It's freaking amazing. But I can remember like so much of it was just about buying records and having exposure to those records, right? Because you couldn't really get them off the internet or any of that type of stuff. So came back in like 99, and my strategy for life really was I could either go back to my parents' house, or I could stay up in Derby where I had DJ gigs and money really that I could return to, and I had a girlfriend and I had a car and I had somewhere to live for fairly cheap, and I just got back into that. And yeah, so picked up on my DJing again, but then it was like, right, I really want to start to do my own thing. I want to start to push more hip hop, because the hip hop was starting to become much more acceptable, right? Like Scratch Perverts, and again, you got to give those guys their dues, man. It's like they were starting to get bigger, and then I would go to these places and I'd be like, hold on, there was a club full of people playing like proper hip hop, I would call it. And you had songs like Simon Says and Dead Prez Hip Hop and like Anti Up and all these types of songs. Right, okay, this can work, right? All my kind of dreams can come true, right? This can kind of really work. So I wanted to do that as well, but I was also looking for a job, and it was like, so I was bumming around for a bit doing that sort of lifestyle. You know, I say bumming around, but I was living as a professional DJ really, so it wasn't too bad. And then I got a job in 2000, my first ever proper job, working for an internet dating startup called udate.com. So I started on the sort of like the work path in digital marketing in 2000. And it was round about then I did my first like proper club night. Did it with my housemate Gordon Gidge and my other mate Dave H. We're like, right, because they had some DJ experience and stuff, and because I had these connections with this student union, we're like, right, okay, we want to put on our own night for like proper hip hop, and that was the motivation. Certainly was for me. We want to do hip hop, we want to do funk and breaks and the same sort of thing. So we sort of did a deal with the SU, and yeah, that's basically what we did. And we put on a party in like end of term party, last week of term with students. We put this guy to headline it. No one had really heard of. We hadn't really heard of him, from Ronin Records, who's kind of like part of that Skips label. And we got like 500-600 people in this venue, and we were like, well, this is incredible, right? And then I started off on my kind of like career doing sort of digital marketing stuff. But then because the student union back then, they had so much power in our town, but because we'd gone out and we'd absolutely elbow greased it, man, and we'd just be like, right, put 600 people in your venue, right, we want to do more. And it was amazing, and they gave us like incredible deals. They were just like venue for free. They even used to pay for our flyers, right, just to kind of get and book these DJs, to get people in our venues. And then we started doing our own club nights, probably heavily for about the next 3 to 4 years, up until I moved to London. And that just became my world. And that, alongside my work life, I was just absolutely tunnel focused on that particular world. Much more of an emphasis on promoting than DJing as well. But that was my absolute world for probably about the next 3 years.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying One to DJ. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show, and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on. So I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some One to DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onetodj.bigcartel.com. And if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. If you're an avid collector of timeless music on vinyl but don't have the budget to fork out for those pricey originals, then look no further than Be With Records. From library music to yacht rock, jazz, hip hop, disco and beyond, Be With lovingly reissue some of the coolest classics. All of their records are carefully remastered and cut to the highest standards to make sure the pressings are of peak audio quality and do justice to the music being released. And something else to note is that they don't do limited runs to drive up resale and hype. If the demand is there, they'll repress, as the focus is the music, not the profit margin. They have flat rate shipping and free UK shipping on orders over £60. And if you head to bewithrecords.com and use the discount code ONCEADJ, all one word, you'll get 10% off your order. So head to bewithrecords.com and level up those crates today. So just to wind back then, with the digital marketing, because I mean that was kind of what brought me to you, getting a bit of help for getting into that world, and
Sure.
I had to do quite a bit of stuff to get buy-in from people to get me into it, because it's not something I've formally trained in. Had you done anything formally that helped you to get that job? Like, what was it that got you in?
Well, it's funny actually. So we talked about magazines earlier, but there was a local listings magazine called Home Cooking, and it was run by my friend Dave H from Derby Jazz Massive. And I actually started, because again, it was all about what could you go out and do and get access to get free music. Another way you could get free music was by writing, right? Remember, there's this passion for music. It was like, would write in the magazine. So I can remember I sort of became friends with Dave for going to his DJ gigs and seeing him about town and being like, right, can I start to write for your magazine? Review gigs or review CDs or whatever. And it was super competitive because lots of people wanted to do it because they wanted free music. And I can remember Dave said to me like, we got an opportunity to interview Africa Baby Band from the Jungle Brothers. We don't, you're into your hip hop stuff. Can you interview him? And I'm like, hell yeah. Didn't know how to do an interview. Didn't have a clue about any of that type of stuff. Like, no, but I wanted to do it because again, access to free music and all that type of stuff. So started writing for the magazine sporadically in 2000s ish, right? Early 2000. And then when there was the advert for U-Date locally, it was interesting because I had no qualifications. I was straight out of uni. I didn't have any, and it wasn't for a digital marketing job then. It was just working at the bottom in customer service, and that's
right.
That's the best way to get into any startup, right? Just get in at the bottom, do whatever you need to do, get a seat on the rocket ship, and then just go from there because opportunities will become abound to you. Like I absolutely would say that to anyone and still say that to anyone to this day. So started off doing customer service and I had no customer service experience. But the reason I mention it is the guy who interviewed me, he knew people from Home Cooking, like, because it was a local thing, right? He's like, oh, okay, you're writing, you're working with them. Okay, that's a decent reference. That's relatable. You can put a sentence together. Here's your name. I can see that. Okay, right, that's going to work for me. So that was a good entrance way into that particular door for me. So that was super helpful. And the lesson is like, just get out there, man. Get out there, get your name out there, hustle, put the connections together, kind of like get all that type of stuff. So I was doing it, but it never really felt like that. It wasn't like, right, this is going to get me a job one day. It was like, no, it was hopefully this gets me more free music, right? That was my motivation to sort of do everything. But that was the connection for there. Worked in, I guess, customer service, just as you'd call it then, and then progressed up to digital marketing. We acquired another business in 2001, and we had a need to migrate our affiliate bases, and I was around. I was quite vocal. I was looking for opportunities, and I can remember my boss at the time, she sort of said, right, we need someone to work on this affiliate marketing piece, right? Here's a textbook, read that this weekend, and on Monday you're doing it. And I was like, okay, great, let's go. And then we just sort of went from there, really. And I think it was very early internet promotion of our club nights from like 2001 to like 2003, 4 onwards, but I was still pushing it, right? It was a lot harder, right, to get websites out. And we had this guy, Isaac, shout to him. And he does like videography stuff these days at a high level. He was taking photos and building websites and stuff like that, which was cool. But I was really trying to push it, but also use it to try to figure out where the other club nights were. And gig swaps were big there because, again, think back to the model, get on more flyers, get sent more free records, yada, yada, right? So it was finding out more nights that did what we did. So we would DJ at their night. They would DJ at our night. They'd put a link on our website. We'd put a link on their website, etc., etc., etc. So we would DJ in places like Bristol, and we DJed in Shrewsbury, and we would DJ kind of like in Nottingham, and just like all these, Leicester and all these other places, just to try to get the kind of word out there on a sort of primitive internet. Not to necessarily say that I was using the skills I was learning, because the worlds felt very, very different at that particular time. But that's certainly the way that I was moving. And it was more like the agents, right? Starting to hustle the agents and get sent through the rosters and trying to get the acts over from the US. And we were fortunate in the fact that we were able to put on some incredible acts from the United States. in a town that we thought that was not really into hip hop at all. Certainly wasn't. You know, we had people that were into hip hop that lived in our town. I mean, we always shout out to Baby J. He's kind of like there. If you mention Derby and hip hop, everyone knows Baby J. So he was obviously there, and he was shout out to him. He was incredibly welcoming to us. You know, we're like, oh, you know, this is your kind of turf. Like, can we do some stuff? He was a G about it, right, and still is to this day. So that was cool, and yeah, we were able to bring acts there like People Under the Stairs, Jay with the Damager, Souls of Mischief. And you're like, if you go back to, you know, 7-8 years ago, I was watching these groups on MTV Raps, right? And then to be in this town where, you know, I thought no one really cared that much about it, and you'd be packing out these venues. It was a drug. It was addictive. It was incredible, right? Just to kind of see this, right? To see all this type of stuff. So, you know, a lot of fun.
So, alongside your full-time job then, how much time do you think in a tip? Were the nights monthly?
We used to do nights monthly, and we would, but mainly through the, when the students were there, right? Because a student town would be very much dictated whether students were there, whether you'd put events on, right? So peak through the autumn season, then through the spring, summer was fairly quiet. But also what we were trying to do was supplement it with our own gigs as well, where we could, but also we'd go down to London, try to check out clubs, try to network with folks, try to do all sorts of things like this. But the one thing I would say at the time, and it was my girlfriend at the time who was totally not into hip hop, and that relationship didn't really last longer term, and that's probably why. But to say that I was obsessed, Adam, this was my world, right? I would do the work stuff, but again, it was different, right? Because you didn't have Blackberries and things like that. I think I maybe got a Blackberry in like 2004 or something like that, and that probably changed everything. But, you know, once you came out of work, you would come out of work. There wasn't really much you could do. So, but I was obsessed, man, promoting, because my attitude was like, look, you can never stop promoting. What I didn't really realize as I was learning marketing, learning these skills, can never stop promoting, right? So I was always promoting, going out, putting up flyers, chatting, networking, buckets of paste, emailing people. It's like any spare time I had, I was really trying to do that promotional thing, because I thought that was what was needed. And, you know, maybe we went too hard and maybe we dedicated too much time for it. It was difficult to say, but because it was really working and we were getting success, we felt like our hard work was part of that. And look, I've always had a decent work ethic. I got that from my dad. He didn't teach me tons of things. He wasn't a great teacher, but hard work was one thing he kind of instilled in me. So we'd be out there, man. I can remember we'd have these incredible shows, absolutely packed out. We'd like bask in it the next day. And it would be cool the next day, right? You'd go into town and you'd see people in the shops. And again, there was no internet really then. You go see people in the shops and they'd dap you up. You go in the record shop the next day. They go, oh, that was cool. We'll talk about this. It was a great feeling. You know, we'd sleep, next day, next Monday, right, we're back on it. Right, what we doing? You know, we were pretty driven in that particular regard, because we didn't want to fail and we didn't want to flop and all that type of stuff. So we were, it was motivating, but all encompassing at the same time, especially because I lived with a guy I promoted the nights with, Gidge, as well. So trying to do that, trying to push our DJing. We got into kind of beat making as well during that particular time, got an MPC and started making beats as well, which was kind of a natural thing to do. I wouldn't say I spent enough time on it, because again, things were a lot more time consuming then and fiddly. You couldn't sit on your phone on a plane like bashing some beats out. Started getting into beats as well, and that was really cool, and sample digging and things of that nature, and going to car boot sales. It was just a life, man, and my life. And you talk about magazines, that was the sort of, again, the next phase of them as well. Big Daddy magazine was based in Nottingham. That was huge. And you had, you know, Fat Lace and Fat Boss and all these types of things. But again, we'd be hustling. And also we started to put out mixtapes and started to think about mixtapes on a more serious level. It's probably around about this time, maybe like 02, 03. And again, my mate Dave H originally came out the idea. We put out these mixtapes called Seasons Beatings, which were like a sort of like a kind of a pastiche themed mixtape, sort of before they were a thing, of like Christmas themed rap and funk and black music records. We started putting those tapes out, and our other mixtapes as well. I used to put mixtapes out with Hudson, and started to get into that. That was just the grind and the hustle, and that was the thing that we just really enjoyed doing it. But if we were working on a mixtape, we'd work on it for, you know, 2 months, right? Not to say it was this masterpiece, but that's just what we did because it took forever, right? We're using sort of basic computer editing stuff here to sort of put drops and stuff like this. And again, like getting drops for mixtapes became like a kind of a full-time obsession. I can remember, right? But it was so much fun, right? And you can imagine, like, you know, my girlfriend at the time thinking, what is all this about? And they did, but it just became an obsession, right? I can remember, you know, going to New York, going on holiday, like, where's that DJ going to be? Mini disc recorder, get this drop, get this tape, and, you know, all this type of stuff. And that was just the life. But that's the life we were living, and that's the life we really, really enjoyed it because our mates were into it, and it was kind of like, yeah, it was all sort of heading in the right direction. And, you know, you would get plaudits and success points by getting reviews in magazines, or, you know, maybe DJ Yoda would review your CD in Hip Hop Connection, and you'd put your CDs at the record shop and they'd sell a few, and that would be that and stuff. And it was just, yeah, good times, man, good times.
Yeah, I mean, the Seasons Beatings mixes, they had a pretty good rep. They spread far and wide, didn't they? I remember talking to Hudson about them a few years ago and him mentioning they were still selling them in Japan.
Yeah, they did really well. And we hooked up with Boombox Distribution, who was Skeg at Breaking Breads, and they were pushing them out. And again, it was just a brilliant thing. We got them in Urban Outfitters, we got them in record shops, we're getting good reviews, all sorts of all over the place and stuff. And yeah, we didn't really want to become pigeonholed for that, but I can remember everything was so manual, so we'd be looking for these records like all year, and we'd be working on this mix in like peak of summer. I can remember 2005, we were working on Seasons Beatings 2, and I remember the Ashes were on in 2005, so it was in the summer working on it because it was so meticulous, so time consuming, trying to get shout outs and stuff. I remember Roy Wood lived in Derby. I remember getting a shout from Roy Wood, finding able to sort of do a shout on our Seasons Beating thing, alongside our other mixtapes as well that we were doing, and that was kind of like, you know, old school sort of backpack type, sort of independent hip hop type stuff that we were doing as well, which was a lot of fun.
I think from the outside as well, it seemed like between you, Gidge, and Dave, you had a really good dynamic and a really good distribution of the responsibilities of putting the nights on as well.
Yes, yeah, pretty much. I mean, look, we had certain things that we did, right? And, you know, Dave was very much like, he wasn't the street guy. Me and Gidge, like, yeah, so Dave did the flyers and did that type of stuff, but he wasn't really the street guy, right? And again, but he was also pushing like, we need a second room. So when we got a venue that had a second room, when we moved to, they changed it in Union 1, we had both rooms, then we had the Gatehouse. That was very much Dave's thing, curating that. And Dave wanted to put bands on, which he'd come from that experience, and that was cool. And he was sort of doing that type of side of it. God was a lot more like the kind of, everyone liked him. He was like the public face, like kind of like getting in those communities, like just kind of, you know, groups of people that'd be mates with him and doing this. And I'd be more like dealing with the agents and dealing with the other promoters and the bands and all that type of stuff. So yeah, it's the division, but it had to be. But also it was never a for-profit thing. Like all those shows we did, I don't even know what happened to the money with it, but we never really took a wage out of it. And I can remember Dave would be like, we should be getting paid. And we were like, no, we shouldn't. We should be putting it back in and reinvesting it. And we'd buy mixers and we'd be stuff like that, but it was never about that. We were somehow hustling, getting our own money on the side, but we weren't getting a wage from it. Like we weren't doing any of that. We were putting it in like a sort of shared bank account and sort of trying to invest in other stuff. But like, yeah, it's just about trying to work with people on the similar types of wavelength. And I think that's when it's hard, right? Because you need to be at the same sort of wavelength at the same sort of time to be able to type of do this stuff and for it to be successful. And it was, and I can remember it was, we sold the U-Date business in back end of 02, start of 03, and then I got a job with Matt. I wanted to move back down to London anyway, because I think I'd sort of served my time up in the Midlands. I wanted to go back to London where it was all happening. And then so I moved back to London. I got a job at Match.com, end of 3, start of 04. And then, but also for me, that was the sort of start of the music kind of changing. Like the UK stuff was really starting to come up and have a lot of prominence. And that was great, don't get me wrong. but we would be booking groups like Kalashnikov and just kind of people, and playing a lot more UK rap, because that was popular in like 2004. Grime was quickly coming, and it would sort of usurp it and take it to another level. But my heart just wasn't in it as much, not as much. It was much more into, I was more into US sort of golden era type stuff. But then I moved away to London, and the night carried on for maybe about a year or so, and we'd have sort of reunion things. But, you know, it was when I moved to London, I sort of went on to a bit of a different phase and sort of like left it behind, and sort of left a lot of that sort of club DJing behind, because when you come to London, it's a very different thing.
Yeah, so did you totally stop DJing in London then, or were you actively trying to get any gigs, or did you just think this is just too competitive, or?
A combination of all of them, actually. So I came back down to London in 2004, and I made a lot of connections, right, in the London world. But again, one of the things that we'd found where we're able to be successful in a small town is you know everyone, right? You go out there, they know you, all that type of stuff. London, obviously, that's a very, very different thing. But the good news was I had some friends that had moved there already. So I met Rob Percy randomly. Me and Hudson met Rob Percy in New York on New Year's Day, actually, with his wife at a Razel and Master O's show. That's a random meet. But we'd met him. He played at our night, so we knew him. We knew Super Ricks. DJ Super Ricks from Southern Hospitality. He was down there. So I kind of knew some people down there. And, you know, so we kind of had a few things in place, but no real strategy. And I can remember I got invited by Skeg, who I knew from Breaking Bread, because we'd invited him to DJ at our night and vice versa. He invited me to start playing on the Breaking Bread show on Itch FM back in like 2004. And that was amazing, because it was slightly post the peak of Itch FM, but they were still the biggest pirate radio station for hip hop in London, absolutely no question. It was slightly post the Kalashnikov peak. They were pushing Kaiser and all these other bands and stuff. But to get exposed to that was amazing, and get to meet loads of those people. I can remember we'd play five-a-side football together, and I'd get to know those guys and stuff like this. We'd be playing five-a-side football, and Brain Tax would be playing, and the Itch FM guys would be playing, and the Mr. Bongos guys would be playing and stuff. It was great to know people in that world. But I had no real strategy in terms of what I was pushing. I was a bit, not say lost, but wouldn't really know what I necessarily wanted to do. And I could also remember in early 2004, Southern Hospitality and Rob and Ricks, they were starting to establish their own thing. And I can remember going to their club nights very early, and I'm like, I don't get this at all. I just don't get it. Because also at the same time, they were writing for Hip Hop Connection, pushing a lot of this Southern stuff, and I was like, I don't get this. Right, but Electricity Showrooms, they were doing that on Fridays, and with Tom Hickey as well. They were pushing. I can remember I went to that club night 3 consecutive nights with 3 consecutive different companions, shall we say? I can remember that. But then I was in another. I embarked on another long-term relationship from like 2004 till about 2010, and that person was very into hip hop. And that was great, and it was kind of appealing, but they weren't really supportive of me pushing that DJ path at all, right? Probably the opposite of that. And I get it, right? I was getting a little bit older. I was probably like 28, 29 at this particular point in time, and work was getting a little bit more serious, and I was getting more into that. And, you know, it was like 30 was on the horizon. So it wasn't something I really pushed. I had no real strategy. I kind of hustled a little bit, right? But didn't really kind of push it too much. And so, yeah, gig here and there. But again, music was changing. I was kind of changing. I guess lots of things started to happen from like 04, 05 onwards, right? I can remember Serato came along, and I got Serato early, and I was like, this is amazing. But then what you had is the rise of digital DJing, the file share websites like Oink, for example, absolutely amazing. The internet was growing a clip. And I can remember the world that I've been super active in and super surrounded by, it started to change, right? In terms of finding rare records and being able to even need to buy records anymore. It just didn't feel the same when the digital stuff happened. And then, so my DJ stuff was sort of dwindling. I was still doing the radio, right? And that was a good outlet. And occasionally I'd do some gigs from time to time. But I think one of the things that I did, which I think was helpful, was like I sort of said in my own head I was retired. I didn't make it a retirement announcement because no one cared, right? But it was like I sort of said in my own head, like, right, I'm retired. And that allowed me to handle it, if you kind of see what I mean. Because it was like, I didn't really have the bandwidth to sort of do the things I was doing before, but also because I was in London, I didn't really have the support structure that I described previously. I didn't really have mates around me that, when you're in London, it's very different. Everyone lives so much further away. I didn't really have mates around me that were doing the same sort of thing that I could necessarily connect and jam with and align with very, very quickly. And then also, like in 2006, I joined a startup called Seatwave, which went on to become Europe's leading ticket exchange. I was the first employee, and we went on an incredible ride for the next certainly 6.5 years I was there, until it was sold to Ticketmaster in 2014. I kind of threw my life into that, right? And that was... And I bought a house and stuff. I just threw my life into that. And I can remember bumping into Rob Percy, like probably around, I don't know, 2008, 2009. And he was like, I haven't seen you. And I'm like, yeah, I just been doing that, you know, and I was in a relationship and sort of doing all the things that you do in a relationship in your sort of like early 30s. You know, you start getting into wine and you travel a lot. And I was traveling a lot to the States as well, traveling through work and traveling through holidays, you know, and still buying records and stuff and trying to sort of connect with it and trying to do bits and bobs, getting into things that you get into as well when you sort of have a bit of money in your 30s, getting into buying trainers and hip-hop memorabilia and all that sort of like man-childy type stuff as well. But no particular DJing. It pretty much run its course. I think we're still putting out Seasons Beatings mixes from time to time, right? Doing some of that, but you know, it was sort of, I think I sort of like missed that sort of camaraderie as well. So I was focusing on pretty much the work path up until that point.
With being in that sort of work, I guess it can just take over a lot and really like just kind of pull you away anyway. Like, did you even have any time to kind of assess whether you were moving in the right direction or not? Because I think that often happens, is we can just, we're taken by things and it's hard to like get back and take stock. And especially if it's happening, you know, you said about the BlackBerry and stuff like that, if you're getting into this where it's kind of harder to come away from work as well.
Yeah, very much so, right? There's a lot more written about this now these days. But yeah, it was the sort of the advent of that, being able to connect into the machine 24 hours a day. I can remember we'd be doing these things like called remote desktoping. We can remote desktoping from home, and we'd all have laptops in perpetuity and smartphones and just kind of access to it. And then you said the sort of advent of social media. So it was ability to, if you want to throw yourself in, you could do, right? I can remember I'd be doing link building to build at SEO on like Saturday nights and Sundays. Because again, I was in a relationship where, again, it wasn't necessarily out pushing my DJ stuff. So I had sort of time where I was sort of in the house as well. So I was kind of getting involved in that and throwing myself into it. But it was you're right, it was the start of that. You could do into it. And it felt natural to me. You know, it felt naturally, certainly worth pushing. And because we were in the ticketing world and very kind of close to entertainment, you know, that was a natural outlet as well, right? Because you started to, rap music was starting to move out of the clubs into the arenas, right? So I'd be working on projects like Watch the Throne and, you know, Drake and just like all these types of sort of like early kind of like arena stuff. But you're still involved, in air quotes, in rap and that type of stuff in some way, and festivals and all these types of things. But it was just going on to another level, right? So you still kind of had an outlet in that world, but sort of early exposure to music industry type stuff, I would say.
So in terms of hip hop then, you referenced golden era stuff as being kind of your benchmark, and then when you talked about that kind of wave in the late 90s, early 2000s, in this period of your life, what sort of stuff were you listening to? Was there anything that was capturing your imagination, or were you still just going back to the previous stuff?
Yeah, definitely golden era, kind of like early 90s to mid 90s rap, just kind of pretty much back in through the 2000s as we started to get progressed. And again, as my life would change and I'd sort of spend more time at home, I would kind of get to the point where I can't listen to this stuff anymore. I've just been too exposed to it. So, but then my musical horizons would start to get a lot broader, right? It would be more sort of home listening, still into samples and breaks and things like that, but certainly got a lot broader. Again, you started to see stuff like Spotify was starting to come out, access to music, access to digital. But yeah, broader, all sorts of different types of stuff. Still kind of kept up to speed with sort of newish kind of hip hop cutting edge hip hop type stuff from time to time, but it was changing. It was coming much more of a club sound, and interesting enough, it was now becoming more into clubs, right? And I can remember as we're getting in through the end of the noughties, start of 2010, I actually exited this relationship end of 10, start of 11, and I was kind of free again, really, to sort of like get back out on the scene. Not in that way, but you know what I mean, and just get exposed to sort of what was happening in the clubs and what was going on in that particular nature, and sort of catch up with this kind of where the sound was then. And I hadn't really appreciated it because I've been listening to it from afar. But then when I was starting to listen to this music in clubs, the way it was designed to be listened to, so from like 2010, 2011 onwards, like the kind of like, post-trap, early kind of like crunk type stuff, I was like, okay, this really, really opened my ears to this particular world. And, I was fortunate enough to kind of have a sort of second bite of the cherry, really. And I absolutely have to credit, Southern Hospitality, who sort of had this incredible place in the sort of London Clubstrasse by this particular time. And because not only had I met, Rob and Super Ricks, and I now met Davey Boy Smith, who's sort of DJing, they welcomed me kind of back into the fold, not only from a social perspective, but also I sort of ended up DJing at a bunch of these events, right? Just sort of, just because they were doing so well and by association. And it's starting to just play much more of this music. And, I ended up having a second sort of DJ life between like, 2012 and 2015. And 2015 I had my first child, and that was really the end of it, chosen by me. But it was a wonderful thing because I got to DJ in the sort of Serato world, like properly, and I was like the warm-up DJ for like Players Ball for like maybe like a year and a half or so, right? A year and a half, 2 years. And it was just incredible. This was like the hypest night, and Rob deserves so much credit for that. The hypest night playing like, and this was 2013, 14, 15. So it was, peak Future, peak Young Thug, peak Chief Keef, and you had all the Lex Luger, Rick Ross type stuff as well, and peak Wiz Khalifa, all this type of music. And I was able to sort of like just be playing this in the clubs, and I'm like, this is such a wonderful opportunity. And so many people my age haven't really done that. They're sort of like stuck in that old world, which I get, but I kind of seen it from both sides. And then I was DJing at festivals through Southern Hospitality, and also I started to have some of my own sort of gigs. Remember, I had an open format sort of type of gig in Shoreditch, up through 2014 through 2015, and it was brilliant. Right, I stopped it when I started having children, but it was just an amazing opportunity because you were now looking at a new generation of people that, hip hop, and especially like R&B tinged hip hop, really, or the hip hop of the time, was not only acceptable, it was encouraged, right? And that was such a kind of move from where it had been, 10, 12, 13 years prior, where I've been doing it more than that. So that was just such a thrill to be part of, right? And again, it was awesome to be an open format DJ in the Serato world because I wasn't having to buy this stuff, right? It's all at your fingertips. Make a crazy request, no problem. And, some of my open format DJing, I guess, would be, R&B to EDM to, a bit of garage, a bit all this type of stuff, but mainly from a kind of like hip hop and R&B type of basis. That would be what people wanted and what I wanted to play. And to transition to the DJ I was before, I'll play the same sets every week, in the same records, in the same order. Thanks very much. Right. And then started getting on the mic and started doing all these types of things, all the things that I never dreamed I'd do before, but like really, really enjoyed it, and can look back with such kind of fond memories. And I was given that opportunity, to just have friends like that, to give you these opportunities and do these social things. But the kind of chance to do it, sort of belie my DJ years a little bit, and just sort of have those experiences. So like, this music's been good to me, man. That's for sure.
I think something that you've kind of hit on there as well is we just talked about how work can kind of pull you along, and you don't realise until you step away from it. I think DJing can do the same thing. And, you can get into this kind of rut with it. You take gigs, particularly when you've had to be a full-time DJ, or if it's the thing you get your validation from in life, you can get into this sort of thing where you're playing all these gigs and stuff, and you don't even know if you're really enjoying it or not. So it is nice, I think, because I kind of stepped away from DJing and I've kind of come back into it again. And it's really nice when you come back into it, knowing a bit more of who you are and knowing what sort of gigs you want. I mean, obviously it's easy with Serato as well, but yeah, it's a nice point.
But it's a lot. It's like a lot of all things, right? It's like if you have to do something to pay your bills versus kind of it's just cream on top of the cake. It's a different attitude towards it, right? And again, I know a lot of full-time DJs that have to approach it in a very, very different way. They approach their DJ life a little bit to how I approach my work life, right? Hustling, networking, out in that particular world, doing it. Versus, as you say, if you can get that balance where you have a fairly calm and regular work life, DJing just becomes fun. It's something you get auxiliary income for that you can maybe use to treat yourself and stuff. That's like a really, really nice balance. And that was that's the way I sort of treated it. I remember when I had my first child, like it was the late nights, man. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go full on into this, step away from it. And, stop drinking, finally stop smoking, by then, believe that. Finally stop smoking, stop drinking, stop doing any of that type of stuff. Went into dad life and never looked back. But you're right. It's like it can become and will become, right, a kind of full-time job, because now you think back to how, sound like an old person, but how easy it is to get hold of that music on that computer, right? And, that person doing that gig that I was doing back in 97, age like 21, 22 for 20 quid, there's people now that will do it for 20 quid, right? But that's just the world, right? That's just the kind of game. But it's interesting to see the folks that have continued on that particular path full time, but also as well, like some of these incredible DJs that you see have just, have so much talent and connections and stuff. They have regular jobs, right? Because it's just, again, it's this conversation is about, does it become a full-time job? Does it not? And all that type of stuff. But yeah, it's been a fun time.
So where's the career gone then since?
Good question. Where's the career gone since? So I'd like to say I'm still connected to that particular world. So after I worked at Seatwave, I became very, very aligned with a business called Who Sampled, and I'm still an advisor to this day, and shout out to them. It's still one of the best apps and sites on the internet, which was the sort of digital progression of sampling online, right? So I kind of go from somewhere where, like, Diamond D know a lot of breaks, but I say no names, which was the sort of opposite to that, and embracing that particular culture. Did some incredible things with them, went to South by Southwest, met so many artists, put on a bunch of events, done loads of stuff, and as I say, continue to advise those guys to be a massive support till this particular day. And still some forays into the entertainment world, right? If I can, but again, like being even exposed to the music industry, even in a little bit of a way for me, I understood that wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. So look, career-wise now, continue to be on a digital marketing path, right? I've now been close to 25 years doing that. Very much working with a number of different businesses, whether it be from an agency standpoint now, or whether it be for a freelance fractional capacity, or mentoring people coming through, or whatever it may be. Sometimes there's a music connection, sometimes there isn't. That's generally kind of where I find myself. I wouldn't say I play hip hop in the house or really get that exposed to it too much. So much of my music intake now is through my children. So I have one Technics deck left, and they kind of have that, right? So I'll go out getting records for them that they kind of listen to and they like playing themselves and stuff and doing that. So that's real fun to sort of get exposed to it again. It's going to be interesting at a point where in the future you speak to your kids, you'd be like, right, they start listening to some of this stuff. Because also as well, like I was such a beats first person. A lot of the lyrics just sort of washed over me a little bit. Yeah. Now you listen back to a lot of it, you're like, flipping hell. It's like, I don't know about this. So it's going to be an interesting time when I actually speak to them and sort of say, well, actually, that means that and that means this. But again, you can contextualize it. So yeah, most of the stuff I listen to is through them. But like a lot of people, don't listen to anything like as much music as I used to listen to. You listen to a lot more, podcast, talk type stuff. We're on a podcast now, so that's a fairly meta point, I think. But again, like, it's music isn't the only outlet that you have anymore. So yeah, certainly a lot more varied.
Amazing. So just a couple more questions then. A couple more things I want to get into. Have you got any key pieces of advice for DJs or for promoters that would want to be starting out now, based on what you know and what you've done?
I would say, look, number one for DJing and promoting, it's like, do it for the right reasons, right? And I think I and the people around me did it for the right reasons, right? We did it because there was a gap in the market in our town. People weren't playing this stuff, right? Never did it to make money. Never did it for any of that particular reason. Just do it for the right reasons, right? Understand, like, you can build a product and build a service for an audience, and you understand that audience, right? And then also number two, just take some risks, man. Just take some risks and, try to redefine what you think is possible. I can remember in the early days of us putting on shows and nights, like we were sticking, and a lot of hip hop was back then, we were sticking to this tried and tested rule book of like, well, we can't do that, right? So other people have to do that. So like, it actually came at the expense of our DJing. So we would always be putting on other DJs, like on our club nights, not us, because we just kind of like, oh, people don't want to listen to us every week. Well, what are you talking about? They want to think about the opposite. And I can remember we really needed a host for our night, because most nights need a host. And I can remember we were like, well, we can't host this. We don't fit the profile, right? So we would, look around for years for different hosts, and we finally ended up finding one who was really good. But it was just like, but then you fast forward many years later, I pick up a mic while I'm DJing, just kind of like part of it. Like, it's all part of it, right? Just wish is those things that you kind of like, if you just pushed it, took a bit of a risk and be like, yeah, you know what? These things are possible. That's what I would say to people. But I think the next phase of DJing, which, I don't have decks anymore. I don't have any of this type of setup, which I guess is the sort of Twitch live stream, Instagram type digital only DJing, which is the way that you get your gigs off the back of it. I have no insight into that world because I've not operated within it. But I could imagine if you want to get anywhere, that's probably the world that you need to penetrate, I should imagine, in the same way that I'll say to anybody from the business world, you need to build that business imprint. So all the technical things that you need to do in that particular world to be a successful Twitch DJ, as I should imagine, is something you need to understand.
And if there was one person that was going to get on this podcast for an interview, who would you like to hear and why?
One person I would love to hear on this podcast is, so like, I was really into crypto stuff for a while. Most of us were, less so these days for obvious reasons. But I guess the sort of once was a DJ, gone on to do incredibly successful things is, I'd say someone at the top of that tree is probably Scott Melker, Wolf of Wall Street. So to kind of hear his DJ story, which I haven't necessarily heard from the start, and how it kind of progressed into other things in a lot of detail, because I know he's done some crazy stuff and I only see snippets on Instagram and Twitter and stuff like. So Scott Melker, that would be a really, really fascinating one.
Great stuff. We'll try and get that in. And my final question is, what was the biggest lesson that you learnt from selling double glazing?
The biggest lesson I learnt from double glazing, like, I think just do what you do with passion and do it seriously. Because I would say I didn't really do that, right? I just took it as a bit of a lark, right? Because it was like, right, get yourself on the sales board, but it was like, get you £3 an hour. That was what you really wanted to do. But I never really took it that seriously. And now one of the challenges was that if you did take it that really seriously, like, you could become a professional double glazing salesman, which I didn't really want to do. But I would say that I just didn't really do it with enough authenticity. It was a means to an end. I was like, right, I'll get enough to get my decks and I'm gone. I wouldn't do it that way if I did it again, with the hindsight I have now. And I wouldn't teach my children to do that. I would be like, right, do it well, do it with passion and do it with authenticity, no matter what it is, because ultimately more could come from it. That's not the way I approach that. So that's probably the lesson I would take from it.
Amazing. I was speaking to Rob Percy the other week, and we were just kind of talking about and realised the amount of opportunities and things you've linked up for both me and him, as well as a few other people. So I'd just like to say on here, thanks for all the opportunities, as well as just thanks for being on the show.
Hey, look, it's appreciated, right? And again, look, this is so much of the economy that we're in right now, right? Connections, but also just being able to just connect people with the right type of people in the right type of way, right? Because it's something that, if you look at doing this in air quotes stuff for so many years, you know the people to recommend and the people and often those people aren't the people getting the opportunities, right? It can often be, you know, who you're married to, or, you know, or what kind of connection you're in. So like that type of stuff, wherever possible, gives me a lot of joy and gratification. You know, be a giver. I'd say that to anybody. And ultimately, like, whether it be advising people or connecting or wherever it can be, it doesn't cost anything. But I think it's just a question of just, sometimes people just need a leg up, a point in the right direction, just connect with the right thing, and then off they go. And again, if those things come back to you in time, they come back to you. If they don't, they don't. But it's real simple. So like, you know, absolutely love what you're doing with your podcast. It's kind of bananas to be on a podcast with some of these DJs that you've had on here, will continue to have, to be on the same list of some of these people. It's kind of mind blowing, right? Feel like a real kind of Charlotte in that regard. But I think look, this foundation, it made so many of us in terms of who we are, and we've gone on to do all sorts of other interesting things. Some of us still DJing, some of us not, but you know, we have a common path, right, in terms of how we grew up and what we learned and what we do, and probably how we think in a lot of particular regards, similar type of age. And it's I'm glad you're telling this story, and it lives on, right? You know, as it kind of should do, because lots of people, when they think about DJs, they think about a certain thing, but it's so I'm really glad you're doing this. I think you're doing it for the right reasons, and it's going to lead to your success, I'm sure.
Great stuff. Thanks for your time, James.
Yeah.
Cheers, mate. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk.
That was nice.